Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. The bustling town of Owamiri was alive with energy, from the boisterous markets to the playful laughter of children. Yet in the sprawling Okafor mansion, silence reigned. Amara Okafor, a 12-year-old girl with an artistic soul, lived there surrounded by cold luxury and emptiness. Her parents, Chief Kenechukwu and Madam Adaora, were titans of the business world, respected for their wealth and influence, but absent in the life of their only child. Amara often wandered through the mansion, her tiny footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. The grand chandeliers and lavish furniture offered little comfort to her. Her parents were always busy, their schedules filled with endless meetings and social obligations. Chief Kenechukwu, a tall and imposing man, was either on his phone or buried in files. Madam Adaora, poised and elegant, divided her time between charity events and high-profile galas. To them, success meant providing the best for their daughter, but they failed to see the emotional void they had created. Every morning, Amara sat at the long dining table waiting for her parents to join her. The aroma of freshly baked bread and steaming tea filled the air, but the seats across from her remained empty. Chiamaka, the housekeeper, would quietly serve her breakfast, her sympathetic eyes saying what words could not. Amara would force a smile and eat in silence, hiding the ache in her chest. At school, her teachers often praised her artistic talent. Her paintings captured raw emotion, a silent cry for connection. One day her teacher, Miss Adebayo, asked her about her latest piece, a vivid depiction of a lone child staring out a window as rain poured down. "This is beautiful, Amara, but also sad." "What inspired it?" Amara shrugged, avoiding the teacher's concerned gaze. "Just something I imagined," she murmured. Despite her loneliness, Amara clung to the hope that one day her parents would notice her. Her birthday was approaching and she decided to ask for a celebration, a small one, just the three of them. She rehearsed her request in front of the mirror, smoothing her school uniform nervously. That evening, as her parents sat in the living room, she approached them cautiously. "Mama, Papa, my birthday is next week. Can we celebrate together? Just us?" Her voice trembled, but her eyes sparkled with anticipation. Chief Kenechukwu barely looked up from his laptop. "Next week? I have a meeting in Lagos, but we'll see." Adaora added, "I'll arrange something special, darling." "Don't worry," their words crushed her. "We'll see" had become a euphemism for "it's not happening." She nodded quietly and retreated to her room, her heart heavy with disappointment. That night she painted a vivid sunset, a fiery sky giving way to darkness. It was her way of expressing the fading hope inside her. When her birthday came, the day passed like any other. Chiamaka baked her a small cake and they sang quietly in the kitchen. Amara's parents were too engrossed in their work to even wish her. She placed her sunset painting on the dining table, hoping they would notice. But they didn't. It sat there, untouched, like the unspoken words she carried in her heart. The day after her birthday, the Okafor mansion buzzed with activity. Not because of Amara, but because her parents were preparing for yet another high-profile event. Chief Kenechukwu had an important business conference in Lagos, and Madam Adaora was hosting a charity gala at the prestigious Emeka Foundation Hall. The house was filled with the scent of freshly ironed suits, expensive perfumes, and the occasional ring of a phone call. Yet amidst the flurry, Amara was invisible. Her sunset painting still sat on the dining table, untouched. She had hoped against all odds that one of her parents would see it and ask about her birthday. When no acknowledgement came, she took the painting back to her room and placed it among the others stacked in a corner. Each canvas told a story, a cry for attention she feared would never be answered. That morning, Chiamaka knocked on her door with a plate of her favorite breakfast, akara and pap. "Nan, eat something. You haven't eaten much since yesterday," the housekeeper said gently, her brow furrowed with concern. Amara forced a smile. "Thank you, Auntie Chiamaka. I'm fine." She wasn't, but what was the point of saying so? Her words would only echo in the vast emptiness of the house. Chiamaka hesitated, then sat beside her. "Your parents love you, Amara. They're just busy." Busy, Amara echoed bitterly. Always busy, the housekeeper sighed. She had watched Amara grow up in this house, her laughter gradually replaced by silence. There was little she could do but be there for the child in whatever small ways she could. That evening, as the mansion emptied of staff and the Okafors departed for their respective engagements, Amara wandered the halls aimlessly. She paused at her parents' study, staring at the photos on the wall, images of the family smiling at various events. To anyone else, they would appear like the perfect family. But Amara knew the truth. Those smiles were for the camera, not for each other. Feeling restless, she decided to take a walk outside. The garden, with its manicured hedges and blooming flowers, was one of the few places she found peace. She sat by the koi pond, watching the fish glide gracefully through the water. The tranquility was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. As the sky darkened, the distant sound of laughter from a neighboring house reached her ears. She could hear children playing, their joy infectious even from afar. Tears welled up in her eyes as she imagined what it would be like to have a family that truly cared. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden bout of dizziness. She clutched the edge of the bench, her vision swimming. The episodes had started a few weeks ago, brief moments of weakness that she had brushed off as nothing serious. But this time it felt different. Her chest tightened and a sharp pain shot through her left arm. She wanted to call out for help, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. Slowly she sank to the ground, clutching her chest. The pain subsided after a few moments, leaving her breathless and shaken. When she finally managed to stand, she made her way back to the house. The episode had left her rattled, but she convinced herself it was just fatigue. After all, who could she tell? Her parents wouldn't listen, and she didn't want to worry Kiamaka. That night as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she made a silent wish for her parents to notice her, to see her, to truly be there. But deep down she feared it would remain just a wish. Days turned into weeks, and Amara's strange episodes of dizziness and chest pain became more frequent. At first they were fleeting, easily dismissed, but as time went on, they grew more intense, leaving her breathless and weak. Amara kept it to herself, convincing herself it wasn't serious. After all, what could she do? Her parents were too busy, and Chiamaka, as kind as she was, couldn't solve everything. One evening, Amara sat by her window sketching a new painting. The night sky above Owemiri was clear, the stars shimmering like tiny diamonds. She drew each one carefully, trying to capture the beauty and vastness of the heavens. Her strokes were slower than usual, her hand trembling slightly as she worked. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She dropped her pencil, clutching her ribs as the air seemed to vanish from her lungs. Gasping, she stumbled to her bed and sat down. The room spun around her, and cold sweat trickled down her forehead. When the pain finally subsided, she lay down, her heart racing. Fear gripped her as she stared at the ceiling, trying to steady her breathing. She wanted to cry out for her parents, but she knew they weren't home. They were attending another event, another gala. The thought stung, but she quickly pushed it aside. She was used to their absence. The next morning, she awoke feeling slightly better. She decided to tell Kiamaka about the episode. As they sat in the kitchen, Amara hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. "Auntie Kiamaka," she began softly, "sometimes I feel strange." Kiamaka looked up from the yam she was peeling, concern flickering across her face. "Strange how, my dear?" Amara hesitated. "Sometimes I get really dizzy, and my chest. It hurts." Kiamaka put down the knife, her face now etched with worry. "Amara, this is not something to ignore. Have you told your parents?" Amara shook her head. "They're busy, and it's probably nothing." Chiamaka frowned. "You must tell them. This is not something to keep quiet about. I will speak to Madame Adaora myself." True to her word, Chiamaka approached Madame Adaora that evening as she prepared for yet another charity event. "Madam, I think Amara needs to see a doctor," she said carefully. Adaora barely looked up from the necklace she was fastening. "Why? Is she sick?" "She says she's feeling dizzy and having chest pains," Chiamaka explained. "It could be something serious." Adora waved her hand dismissively. "Amara is fine. Children exaggerate. She's probably tired from school. I'll check on her later," but later never came. That night, Amara tried to speak to her father. She found him in his study, reviewing documents for an upcoming deal. "Papa, I've been feeling." "Not now, Amara," he interrupted, not even glancing at her. "We'll talk later." She stood there for a moment, the words stuck in her throat, before turning away. As she walked back to her room, she felt a familiar pang of sadness. She clutched her chest, not from pain this time, but from the ache of being invisible in her own home. The warning signs were there, glaring and urgent, but they were ignored, brushed aside as mere childhood complaints. And as the days passed, the signs only grew louder, threatening to break through the silence that enveloped the Okafor family. The night was still, the usual hum of activity in the Okafor mansion replaced by an eerie quiet. The house seemed larger, emptier, as though it were holding its breath. Amara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her chest felt tight again, a dull ache that had become almost familiar. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it would pass like it always did. Her parents were out once again. Chief Kenechukwu was attending a late-night business dinner, and Madame Adaora had flown to Abuja for a high-profile fundraiser. Amara didn't bother asking when they'd be back. She already knew the answer, soon, though soon often meant days. Around midnight, Amara woke with a start. The pain in her chest was no longer dull. It was sharp, radiating down her arm and into her back. Panic surged through her as she tried to sit up, only to find that her body felt too heavy to move. Her breathing was shallow, every breath a struggle. She called out weakly, "Auntie Chiamaka," but her voice was barely a whisper. Tears streamed down her face as the pain intensified, her small hands clutching at her chest. In the servants' quarters, Chiamaka stirred, something instinctively pulling her from her sleep. She had grown to trust her gut over the years, and tonight it screamed that something was wrong. She grabbed a robe and hurried to the main house, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When she reached Amara's room and saw her lying there, pale and trembling, her heart sank. "Amara, what's wrong, my child?" she cried, rushing to her side. I can't breathe," Amara gasped, her voice barely audible. Chiamaka didn't waste a second. She grabbed her phone and called Madame Adaora, but the line went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, she tried Chief Kenechukwu, who answered on the third ring. "Chiamaka, this had better be important," he said, irritation clear in his tone. "It's Amara," she exclaimed. "She's very sick." "I think it's serious," Kenechukwu sighed heavily. "Give her some water and let her rest. I'll check on her in the morning." "No," Chiamaka shouted, her voice trembling with urgency. "She needs a doctor now," but the line went dead. Determined not to waste any more time, Chiamaka wrapped Amara in a blanket and carried her to the car. The drive to the nearest clinic in Omenka was a blur, Chiamaka praying aloud as Amara's condition worsened. The clinic's doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, took one look at Amara and shook his head. "She needs specialized care," he said gravely. "Her condition is critical, and we don't have the equipment to treat her here." Chiamaka's hands trembled as she called Kenechukwu again, her voice cracking with desperation. "They say she needs to go to a bigger hospital." "Please, Chief, come now." Kenechukwu finally realized the gravity of the situation. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice tight with fear. As the hours passed, Amara drifted in and out of consciousness. She opened her eyes briefly to see Chiamaka's tear-streaked face and whispered, "Mama, Papa," before slipping back into darkness. When her parents arrived at the clinic, the guilt on their faces was palpable. Adaora sobbed as she held her daughter's hand, whispering apologies that Amara couldn't hear. Kenechukwu, always composed, looked shattered as the doctor explained the severity of the situation. "She's stable for now, but her heart is weak. We need to transfer her immediately," the doctor said. For the first time in years, the Okafors set aside everything, their businesses, their reputations, and focused on their daughter. But deep down, they couldn't shake the gnawing fear that it might already be too late. The air in the clinic's waiting room was thick with tension. Adora paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, while Kenchukwu sat slumped in a chair, his face buried in his hands. The quiet hum of medical equipment in the background only deepened their unease. Chiamaka stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly together as she prayed under her breath. Every second felt like an eternity. The doctor returned, his face grim. We've stabilized her for now, but her condition is critical. We need to transfer her to St. Kenna's Specialist Hospital in Uguma immediately. They have the facilities to treat her. Adaora's knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of a table for support. Doctor, will she survive? She whispered, her voice trembling. The doctor hesitated. We'll do everything we can, but time is of the essence. Kenichuku shot to his feet. I'll arrange for an air ambulance right now. He fumbled with his phone, dialing contacts with shaking hands. His usual confidence was replaced with sheer panic. Chief, the nearest air ambulance is in Nzekwe City. It will take hours to get here, his assistant informed him. The weight of the delay settled over them like a storm cloud. We can't wait that long, Adaora cried. We'll take her by road. The doctor nodded reluctantly. It's risky, but it's her only chance. Within minutes, they were on their way, Amara lying unconscious in the back seat of Kenichuku's SUV. The roads were dark and winding, the headlights cutting through the night like a fragile lifeline. Adaora held Amara's hand tightly, whispering prayers between sobs. Chiamaka sat beside her, silently rubbing Amara's forehead with a damp cloth. The journey to Uguma felt endless. Every bump in the road sent shudders through the vehicle, and every passing second felt like a countdown to an uncertain fate. Kenichuku drove with a reckless determination, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Stay with us, Amara, Adaora murmured. Tears streamed down her face as she thought of all the moments she had missed. Birthdays uncelebrated, school plays unattended, conversations cut short. Regret clawed at her heart like a relentless beast. As they approached the outskirts of Uguma, disaster struck. A massive truck had overturned on the main highway, blocking their path. The red taillights of a long line of vehicles stretched into the distance. Kenichuku slammed his hands against the steering wheel in frustration. We can't wait in this, he yelled. There's an alternate route through Inkuo Forest, Chiamaka said. It's rough, but it will get us there faster. Without hesitation, Kenichuku turned the vehicle onto the narrow, unpaved road. The SUV jolted violently over the uneven terrain, but no one complained. Their focus was entirely on Amara, whose shallow breaths grew fainter with each passing mile. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they saw the glowing sign for St. Ikena's Specialist Hospital. The sight brought a flicker of hope to their despairing hearts. Medical staff rushed out with a stretcher as soon as they arrived, quickly transferring Amara inside. As the doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, Kenichuku and Adaora stood outside the operating room, holding on to each other for the first time in years. Their hands trembled, their faces pale with fear. The walls around them seemed to close in as they waited for news. Hours passed and the tension was suffocating. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was unreadable. We've stabilized her, he said, and a collective sigh of relief filled the room. But then he added, she's not out of danger yet. Her condition is extremely delicate, and the next 24 hours will be critical. Adaora collapsed into a chair, her body racked with sobs. Kenichuku sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. Chiamaka silently crossed herself, tears streaming down her face. Amara's fight for survival was far from over. But for her parents, the realization was sinking in. This wasn't just about saving her life. It was about saving the family they had almost lost to neglect. The sterile white walls of St. Ikena's Specialist Hospital seemed to close in on Adaora and Kenichuku as they waited in the family lounge. The doctor's warning echoed in their minds. The next 24 hours will be critical. Time felt suspended, each second dragging painfully as they stared at the clock on the wall. For the first time in years, neither spoke of business deals or social engagements. The weight of their failure as parents bore down on them with suffocating clarity. Adaora clutched Amara's favorite scarf tightly in her hands, her knuckles pale from the pressure. She had found it in the SUV during the chaotic ride to the hospital, its familiar scent bringing her daughter's presence closer. Tears rolled down her cheeks as memories flooded back, the moments she had ignored, the conversations she had cut short. She used to beg me to come to her school plays, Adaora whispered, her voice breaking. I always said I was too busy. What kind of mother does that? Kenichuku sat across from her, his usually commanding posture now hunched and defeated. I told myself I was doing it for her, for the future. But what future is there if she's not in it? His voice was thick with emotion, a rare display of vulnerability from a man who prided himself on being unshakable. Chiamaka, who had been sitting silently nearby, finally spoke. "It's not too late," she said softly. "If God spares her life, you have a chance to make things right." But deep down, they all feared that it might already be too late. Inside the ICU, Amara's small body lay connected to a maze of wires and monitors. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only indication that she was still holding on. The doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, administering medications and adjusting her oxygen levels. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with concern. As the hours dragged on, Adaora found herself wandering the hospital corridors, unable to sit still. She stopped at the chapel, a small, dimly lit room filled with rows of wooden pews. Falling to her knees, she clasped her hands together and prayed aloud. "God, please, don't take her from us. I know I've failed her. I know I've been blind to what matters most. But if you give us one more chance, I promise I'll change. I'll be the mother she deserves." Her sobs echoed through the empty chapel, the sound raw and unfiltered. Meanwhile, Kenechukwu remained in the lounge, staring at the floor. His mind raced with thoughts of his own shortcomings. He had built an empire, amassed wealth and power, but he had failed at the most important role of all, being a father. He remembered the nights Amara had waited for him to come home, only for him to be too exhausted or preoccupied to even say goodnight. A soft knock on the door startled him. It was Chiamaka holding 2 steaming cups of tea. "You should drink something, Chief," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He shook his head. "How can I, knowing that we might lose her?" Chiamaka placed a hand on his shoulder. "Pray, it's all we can do now." As dawn broke, the doctor reappeared, his face still unreadable. Adaora and Kenechukwu rushed to him, their hearts pounding in unison. "How is she?" Adaora asked, her voice trembling. "She's stable," the doctor replied, and relief washed over them. But his next words brought their fears rushing back. "However, her heart is still very weak. We need to perform surgery as soon as possible, but it's a high-risk procedure. You'll need to prepare for any outcome." Adaora nearly collapsed at the words, her knees buckling as Kenechukwu caught her. "Any outcome," Kenechukwu repeated, his voice laced with desperation. "You mean she might?" The doctor nodded solemnly. "We'll do everything in our power, but the decision must be made quickly." As the Okafors signed the consent forms, their hands trembling, they realized just how fragile life truly was. They had been so consumed by their ambitions that they had failed to cherish the one thing that mattered most. Now, as the doctors prepared for surgery, they could only hope and pray that their newfound resolve hadn't come too late. The operating room doors swung shut with a cold finality, leaving Kenechukwu and Adaora in the corridor, clutching each other like survivors of a shipwreck. They had signed the consent forms for Amara's high-risk surgery, but the enormity of what was at stake loomed over them like a dark cloud. Every second felt like a lifetime, and the quiet hum of hospital machinery only amplified the silence between them. "Do you think she'll make it?" Adaora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has to," Kenechukwu replied, though his tone betrayed his fear. For a man who had always controlled every aspect of his life, this helplessness was foreign and unbearable. Chiamaka joined them, holding a rosary tightly in her hands. She sat beside Adaora and began to pray aloud, her words steady and resolute. The sound of her prayer filled the sterile hallway, a fragile thread of hope amidst the crushing despair. As the hours dragged on, Kenechukwu found himself wandering aimlessly. He paused at the window of the pediatric ward, watching other children laugh and play despite their illnesses. The sight pierced his heart. Amara should be here, smiling and full of life, not fighting for survival on an operating table. Inside the operating room, the surgical team worked with precision and urgency. The lead surgeon, Dr. Obina, was one of the best in Uguma, but even he couldn't hide the strain on his face. Amara's condition was worse than they had anticipated. Her heart struggled against the odds, its rhythm faltering as the minutes ticked by. "She's crashing," a nurse announced, her voice tight with urgency. Administer another dose of epinephrine, Dr. Obina ordered. The room buzzed with controlled chaos as they fought to stabilize her. For a moment, the heart monitor flatlined, its shrill beep slicing through the air like a knife. "Come on, Amara," Dr. Obina muttered under his breath, his gloved hands moving deftly. Outside, the flatline seemed to echo in Kenichuku's and Adaura's hearts. Though they couldn't hear the sound, an inexplicable dread gripped them both at the same moment. "I can't lose her," Adaura whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't. You won't," Kenichuku said, but his voice broke. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as though he could shield her from the pain. The minutes stretched into hours, and then the doors finally opened. Dr. Obina emerged, his face drawn and weary. Adaora and Kenichuku sprang to their feet, their eyes searching his for any sign of hope. "She's alive," he said, and relief washed over them like a tidal wave. "But," he continued, "her recovery will be delicate. The surgery was successful, but her heart is very fragile. She'll need round-the-clock care and a lot of support. The next few weeks will be critical." Adora nearly collapsed, her legs trembling as the weight of the ordeal hit her. Kenichuku steadied her, though his own hands were shaking. "Can we see her?" Adora asked, desperation etched in her voice. Dr. Obina nodded. "One at a time for now." Adaura entered the recovery room first. Seeing Amara lying there, pale and motionless, broke her heart all over again. Tubes and monitors surrounded her small body, but her chest rose and fell steadily, a sign of life, fragile yet persistent. Adora sank into the chair beside her, taking her daughter's hand in hers. "I'm so sorry, my baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have been there for you. I should have seen how much you needed me." Tears fell onto the bed as she poured out her regrets. "But I promise if you wake up, things will be different. I'll be the mother you deserve. Just, please come back to us." Outside the room, Kenichuku leaned against the wall, his hands pressed to his face. The guilt was unbearable. He thought of all the times he had chosen meetings over family dinners, deals over bedtime stories. For what? None of it mattered now. All he wanted was to hear Amara's voice, to see her smile, to have one more chance to make things right. As the night deepened, a nurse gently reminded them to rest, but neither could bear to leave. They remained by Amara's side, holding vigil, praying for a miracle. Little did they know the fight wasn't over. The soft hum of hospital machines filled the air as Amara lay in her bed, her chest rising and falling faintly. Adaora and Kenichuku sat on either side of her, holding her hands, whispering words of comfort. The doctors had warned them that her condition was still precarious, despite the surgery's success. For the first time in their lives, the wealth and power they had built felt utterly meaningless. Amara's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile appeared on her lips when she saw her parents. "Mama, Papa," she murmured, her voice fragile like the whisper of a breeze. "We're here, my baby," Adora said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she gently stroked her daughter's hair. "We're not leaving you ever again." Kenichuku leaned closer, gripping her hand tightly. "You're going to get better, Amara. We'll take you home, and everything will be different. I promise." Amara's smile grew faintly, but her eyes held a deep sadness. "It's okay, Papa," she whispered. "I know you love me now." Her words pierced them both. It was a bittersweet comfort, but it also carried a weight that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. The hours passed slowly. As the sun began to set, Amara's breathing grew weaker. The doctor came in to check on her, his face grave as he adjusted the monitors. "We're doing everything we can," he said softly, but his tone held little hope. Adaora clutched Amara's hand tighter, her heart breaking with every shallow breath her daughter took. "Please, Amara," she whispered. "You have to stay with us. We need you." "I need you, Mama," Amara said faintly, her gaze unfocused. "Do you remember the story you used to tell me about the stars?" Adaura's breath caught in her throat. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "That the stars are always watching over us, no matter where we are." Amara nodded weakly. "Maybe. I'll be one of them, watching you and Papa." "No," Adaora cried, her voice cracking. "You're staying here with us, Amara. You're not leaving." Kenichuku wiped his eyes, his composure shattered. "Amara, listen to me," he said, his voice desperate. "You're strong, my girl. You can fight this." Amara gave him a faint smile. I'm tired, Papa. I just want to rest. Her words sent a wave of anguish crashing over them. Kenechukwu buried his face in his hands, while Adaora sobbed openly, holding her daughter's hand as though she could anchor her to life. As night fell, the monitors began to beep erratically. The nurses rushed in, followed by the doctor. She's crashing, someone said, their voice urgent. Adaora and Kenechukwu were ushered out of the room, but they refused to leave. They stood by the door, watching as the medical team worked frantically. Stay with us, Amara, Adaora whispered, her tears falling unchecked. Please stay. The flat line came suddenly, a piercing sound that shattered the room. The doctor stopped, his hands trembling. Slowly, he turned to face the Okafors, his expression one of deep sorrow. I'm so sorry, he said. We did everything we could. Adaora screamed, collapsing to the floor as Kenechukwu caught her. His own face was a mask of grief, his body trembling with the weight of his guilt. No, no, he whispered, his voice hollow. The days after Amara's death were a blur. The mansion felt emptier than ever, its grandeur a cruel reminder of what they had lost. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the echo of their regrets. They buried her in a small private ceremony in Owemiri. Adaora placed one of Amara's paintings, a vibrant sunrise, on her grave, a symbol of the light she had brought into their lives. Months later, Kenechukwu and Adaora sat in Amara's room, which they had left untouched. Her journal lay open on the bed, her words a haunting echo of her pain. I wish Mama and Papa could see me, one entry read. Maybe if I was gone, they'd notice. Adaora broke down, her sobs shaking her entire body. We failed her, she whispered. We failed our baby. Kenechukwu placed a hand on her shoulder, his own tears falling freely. We can't change the past, he said, his voice thick with grief. But we can make sure her story helps others. Together, they established the Amara Foundation, dedicated to supporting children and raising awareness about neglect. It was a small comfort, but it gave them a purpose, a way to honor the daughter they had lost too soon. As they stood by Amara's grave one evening, the sky above them filled with stars. Adaora looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. Do you think she's watching us? She asked softly. Kenechukwu nodded. I know she is. Though their pain would never fully fade, they carried Amara's memory with them, a reminder of the fragile beauty of life and the cost of taking it for granted. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.